Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody's ready after, I think a lot of you were here yesterday, and we had a great day. We had a lot of great speakers. Today, we've got a fantastic lineup again. As the little video said, remember this is networking, and so we're about meeting people we haven't met before. We're about making sure we're taking notes and offering constructive criticism to the comments and things that you hear on this floor. So we are going to get started with an amazing first panel, and I'm going to turn it over to one of our graduate students, Taylor Helmkamp, to give the introduction.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of our 2024 Connections Conference. My name is Taylor Helmkamp, and I'm a dual degree student with the University of Texas School of Law and UT's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing Adam I. Klein, the director of UT Austin's Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and the director of Strauss's Program on Technology, Security, and Global Affairs. He also serves as a senior lecturer at the University of Texas School of Law, and his specialties include constitutional law, international law, national security law, the Supreme Court, and U.S. foreign relations law. Professor Klein received Bachelor of Arts degrees from Northwestern University and a Juris Doctor degree from Columbia University in New York. Thank you for moderating our first panel of the day, Professor Klein. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Would have been more dramatic to do that beauty pageant style, to have them introduced individually as they came down, but we're improvising, we're doing our best. Good morning, everyone.
I was promised walk-on music.
What would your track be, Bobby? They put him on the spot there.
Texas flood.
Texas flood, great choice. Okay. On that subject, there's another flood, the flood of cyber attacks. Got it, everyone with me? Here we are today to discuss defending the nation, defending critical infrastructure, defending our university and our companies and our industry from cyber attacks, cyber threats that have various goals to unsettle our population, to steal intellectual property, to disrupt, and most worryingly, in my opinion, to lay the groundwork for potential hostile action in the event of armed conflict. We're fortunate to have 4 of the nation's leading experts in different areas of cybersecurity, cyber conflict, so we'll hear a really good mix of opinions today. I'll briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into it. And after the introduction for each panelist, they'll give a brief set of opening remarks. So first, we'll start with Dean Bobby Chesney, who is Dean of Texas Law, where he also holds the James Baker Chair in the Rule of Law and World Affairs. He was previously, and this is his most important accomplishment, the director of the Strauss Center at the University of Texas at Austin. And so I'm privileged to serve him in that capacity. He's a renowned scholar on cybersecurity law, most relevant here, also counterterrorism law, intelligence, and national security more generally. He has served on the Cybersecurity Advisory Committee for the U.S. government's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and has also served in the Justice Department on the Detention Policy Task Force. Dean Chesney.
Thank you very much. Adam, should I jump in with my remarks now, or are we going to go? Okay. So I thought I'd use my first few minutes here just to set the landscape. And I'm going to say a few words about the nature of the threat and a few words about the nature of the toolkits that our government has just available to it to respond to this. And I promise you it won't be a very uplifting account, but I think it'll be an accurate one. So when we talk about the threat, I think it's helpful to consider that we're not concerned with run-of-the-mill threats in the context of this conversation, but rather the strategic dimension of the threat. And from my perspective, it's helpful to conceive of the strategic dimension of threats in the cyber domain as having at least 3 major layers. And so let me go through those 3 layers first, and then I'll talk about responsive tools. There's no particular order here. One layer is the familiar espionage layer. And if you had the same event 10 years ago, we would be spending a lot of time talking about the overall economic impact and competitive disadvantages the United States experiences through the loss of intellectual property, through state-sponsored, commercially targeted espionage. Former Director of National Intelligence Clapper famously referred to this about a decade ago as one of the greatest transfers of wealth in human history, if you accumulate the impact of what was stolen over time. That used to be a dominant frame for this domain. It used to be a major frame through which we thought about why at the strategic level should we really be concerned about cybersecurity. And that continues to be a real problem. It's worth noting, however, that the primary source of that problem, the People's Republic of China, has transitioned to pretty fair ways from where it was 10 years ago versus where it is today in terms of where they are on the value chain. 10 years ago, it was a strategic imperative for them to jump up the value chain as fast as possible. It continues to be so, but they've made a ton of progress, and the strategic salience of stealing, if possible, some cutting-edge strategic technology, it's a little different in today's world given Chinese capabilities versus what it was then. Still a big deal. NVIDIA is about to announce sometime this week a major breakthrough in high-end chip capabilities. That's a strategic asset that's a precious secret that needs to be protected. It has strategic consequences if the capability could be replicated elsewhere. So there are still current examples of cutting-edge technical advantage where cybersecurity really, really matters in that same traditional sense. But it is still a little bit different today, and it's become a little bit more normalized alongside of more conventional espionage threats. So that layer still matters. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's begun to be normalized. And then you have the rise of other layers of the threats. So a second layer to pay attention to, it's the systematic impact of criminal behavior, of money-seeking behavior, the majority of which is in the hands or facilitated by entities located outside the United States, non-state actors, though very, very often with a roof over their heads provided by a degree of impunity made possible by sponsoring or tolerating local government, particularly in Russia, but not just there. And I want to give the example of ransomware as a service, as a key illustration. In fact, let me draw on the recent kerfuffle around ALPH-V or Black Cat. The ransomware as a service capability that certain clusters of ransomware developers make available on the dark web. The model is that they're not necessarily or even often going to be the ones deploying the capability themselves. They are basically providing the capability to others who then deploy it, and then the proceeds from the ransoms get split, in effect. And if you've heard something about the impact on the American healthcare sector, pharmacies, doctors, et cetera, maybe you've even experienced it. If you've had a doctor's appointment over the past few weeks and there was a problem with the payment system, it's because Choice Healthcare, which is, it turns out, a major node for providing payment systems to American pharmacies and small to mid-sized medical operations, they became subject to a ransomware attack associated with the Black Cat group's capabilities, and it just shut them down. And by extension, it shut down all kinds of entities around the country. People have not been able to make payroll. This is similar to Colonial Pipeline, which had an impact that could be felt by people who don't normally pay attention to cyber, although you kind of have to be either involved in one of these entities that's having their business totally disrupted by this, or a patient of one of them to feel the impact. But a lot of people are feeling it. It's an illustration of many things. Ransomware as a service is a way of taking a harm capability and diffusing it so that it can be deployed and used by a large number of actors rather than a small number of actors. The possibility that a $22 million Bitcoin payment attributed to Black Cat as a recipient on a known Bitcoin wallet that they control, probably associated with this, is a little indicator, a reminder of the amount of money that's at stake here. That amount of money ensures this is going to continue. The leverage and the benefit is through the roof. The impunity with which the actors are able to operate, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, that's very important too. So the systematic effects across the board of all this are really important, and they matter at the strategic level. But last, and perhaps best illustrated by the recent news coverage of the Volt Typhoon story. Let me pause here to editorialize. there are a million different cybersecurity companies and threat analysts, and for whatever reason, for some reason, they've all decided they refuse to use each other's names when describing threat actors. So everyone has this way overly cute, way overly clever naming set of conventions, and for some reason, everyone's really loath to just say PRC, Ministry of State Security, or SVR, Russian intelligence. They want to say Volt Typhoon or Holiday Bear. I guess it's fun, but it's confusing for the rest of us trying to track it all. Volt Typhoon is a Chinese government or government-sponsored capability that involves penetration of critical infrastructure systems in the United States, electric, transportation, water, you name it. It's been an unfolding, ongoing story over the past couple of months that access has been attempted across a wide range of critical infrastructure sectors. And the dominant narrative is, hey, pay attention to this. This isn't about espionage. This isn't ransomware. This is pre-positioning or attempted pre-positioning of capabilities in the event things cook off in the Taiwan Strait. Maybe it's preparation to the battlefield. Maybe it's actually an attempt to deter by being seen to be doing these things so as to create that chilling effect. We had a similar wave of media attention to this sort of thing with Russia in the American electric grid. This was covered by Ellen Nakashima in the Washington Post a couple of years ago. This is the scariest and most obviously national security-centric dimension of things. So there's a threat picture. Let me just really quickly tick off the tool set that's available to us to respond to this state of affairs, because the status quo is not a comfortable one, I think we can see. Toolkit number one, imposing cost on the bad guys, the attackers. Largely ineffectual for a host of reasons. One, what I mentioned earlier, a lot of the strategic level of threat largely emanates from abroad in places where we have no realistic chance of getting cooperation in an arrest, taking out the individuals. So imposing costs through prosecution, not often very effective. Occasionally get counterexamples. What about imposing financial costs? Can you sue them? Same problem. What about imposing financial costs through sanctions? We've done about as much of that as we can. It's not driving foreign government behavior where there is impunity, and it's not having a lot of effect, although it's not a bad thing to do, but it's still not having a lot of effect to make the problem better. What about more dramatic forms of cost imposition, covert action, military action? It's so escalatory, and as far as the public record indicates, we haven't done much, if anything, that rises to that level. What about trying to impose cost on those who aren't spending enough in their own defense? In other words, trying to pressure our own assets to spend more in defense. That is certainly something you see. You see that in discussions about potentially making software or hardware makers who put forward insufficiently protected products, making them liable. Whether that will ever get through Congress, who knows? What you do see a lot of is regulatory behavior by the FTC and others to come after people who have inadequate defense, try to pressure them to do more. It helps. It's better than just leaving it to the market, but whether it's really going to provide a cure, I'm very doubtful of that. What's left? Taking a direct governmental role in disrupting harmful activities themselves, whether it's Cyber Command or FBI. FBI has been a little more visible in the public record. The other day, they acted against Black Cat and Alpha V, along with a number of other law enforcement agencies, seizing what was effectively the dark web homepage for Black Cat's ransomware as a service operation. It got a lot of attention, was much applauded. It doesn't seem to have had a lot of effect. Black Cat and Alpha V is still operating from other sites now. And it illustrates something important. The choke point isn't really the websites through which these capabilities are communicated and transacted. It's the individuals. And we can seize the occasional website. They can start up another one elsewhere. Until we figure out a better way to put pressure on the individuals and those who sponsor them, we're not likely to see a great improvement in this situation. Okay, thank you very much for participating in my very uplifting morning boost.
Great, thank you, Dean Chesney. Francesca Lockhar leads the Cybersecurity Clinic here at the University of Texas at Austin. You can tell us more about what that is, but it suffices to say it's an innovative effort in which students trained by Professor Lockhar learn basic cybersecurity skills and then go out into the community to improve the overall level of readiness. Previously, Professor Lockhar managed the Homeland Security Unit at the Texas Department of Public Safety's Intelligence and Counterterrorism Division. There, she oversaw strategic intelligence analysis programs on counterterrorism, counterintelligence, cybersecurity, and critical infrastructure protection for the state of Texas. And most importantly, she is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Lockhar.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. As Professor Klein mentioned, I'm the director of the Applied Cybersecurity Community Clinic. There's 3 C's in there that are mixed up very commonly, ACCC, if you will. The Applied Cybersecurity Community Clinic here at UT Austin. So as mentioned, this is a university effort to essentially do a few things. One would be provide students here at the University of Texas, both undergraduate and now graduate level, with some experience in cybersecurity, with some basic training to equip them to enter entry-level cybersecurity jobs, should they so choose. Secondary goal, of course, would be fostering community resilience. So as Dean Chesney laid out, the situation out there is pretty dire, and I certainly won't be a ray of sunshine about what our local organizations, small to mid-sized businesses, NGOs, even public sector entities like school districts, what they're facing in terms of the threat is very similar, particularly when it comes to protecting very sensitive juvenile health data, et cetera, et cetera. So these community organizations and public sector agencies and small businesses, they need cybersecurity support, yet they are what we would consider target rich and resource challenged, meaning they're not necessarily the primary target of a lot of government services to shore up cybersecurity defenses and resilience. Maybe they're too small, maybe it's intended to be handled at the city or the county level. Or these organizations simply don't have the budget, the funding, the know-how, et cetera, to access a managed security service provider or some other kind of formal cybersecurity support or information security program at their organization. So our students, as described, learn basic to intermediate cybersecurity in 1 semester, and then they deploy in teams into the greater kind of Austin, Texas and Central Texas community to work with organizations like those that I described to assess their risks, educate these organizations about their risks and ensure that there's not just training and awareness, but then also implement basic, very high value cybersecurity controls for these organizations, develop policies, develop how-to guides and resources for managing these tools and controls long term. And the goal here is to bring these organizations up to kind of a minimum baseline of protection. It's not necessarily a guarantee they won't ever suffer a cybersecurity incident. And indeed, many of our client organizations already have, which is why they are seeking clinic services and recognize the scope and scale of the threat to their assets and their organization. But it's to provide preparedness and provide resilience and act as a force multiplier for some of the national efforts led by CISA and others to not just educate about cybersecurity risks amongst the general public and organizations like these, but bring everybody up to that defensive floor, which is often best accomplished, I would say, through local partnerships like with local universities, as in UT Austin. As far as kind of the workforce, I think the longer term goal of the clinic would be to pipeline, of course, our students into the cybersecurity workforce, be that they continue on to the University of Texas School of Law and become cybersecurity and national security focused prosecutors, or they go the private sector route and work for Huntress or CrowdStrike as cybersecurity threat analysts, researchers, ethical hackers, et cetera. It seems, and the data show, that the cybersecurity workforce in the United States is severely lacking. The most recent data, which is compiled by an organization, CyberSeek, indicates that both Texas and nationwide, we only have about 72% of the necessary cybersecurity workforce in comparison to the number of job postings that are out there, as well as new initiatives and centers and programs that are being created within our government. And that translates to roughly 570,000 open cybersecurity jobs. Again, of various types. These aren't all necessarily kind of hands-on keyboard incident response jobs. But to that end, we want to not only provide the students a great career launching work experience, but also encourage them to find a job in the industry that aligns with their broader academic interests, that aligns with their broader values, and again, contributes to what we commonly refer to as kind of the cyber civil defense mission. Unlike a lot of our other defensive organizations, the military, the intelligence community, cybersecurity jobs are available in essentially every municipality, every locality, every sector, right? Public, private, and so on. So there's a wealth of opportunity and there's a real opportunity for our students to make a difference and seek a mission-driven kind of public service-minded career after they complete their time in the clinic. So that's our goal. And as far as kind of quantifying like the threat and where this came from kind of on the local level. The clinic is a partnership with the City of Austin and with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's Cybersecurity Advisory Board, on which Dean Chesney previously served. All of these entities recognized that having these local partnerships is often a more kind of trusted and valuable way for organizations like those we serve to seek cybersecurity services. And indeed, individuals within the Austin community, organizations within the Austin community, not sure of where to turn, we're calling the city, essentially calling our 311 service to report phishing attacks, to report scam or cyber fraud incidents. And there wasn't really a great mechanism for serving them with connecting them to follow-on resources. So hence the genesis of the clinic, and we're one of about 15 active programs like this currently in the United States, with 10 more coming online sometime this calendar year, thanks to a generous investment by Google.org and growing and expanding this cyber civil defense effort at universities. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that's somewhat rosier, in that we're trying to help mitigate some of that threat that Dean Chesney laid out on the national level that's trickling down into our local communities and organizations and affecting people kind of in real time in their day-to-day lives and enterprises.
Wonderful, thank you. John Hammond, who you can tell is a real cyber person. He's wearing a sweatshirt, not a tie like me. I can barely turn on a computer. John Hammond is a cybersecurity researcher, educator, and, most excitingly, content creator. As part of the research and development threat operations team at Huntress, John spends his days analyzing malware and making hackers earn their access. Previously, as a Department of Defense Cyber Training Academy instructor, he taught the Cyber Threat Emulation course, which teaches both civilian and military members on various scripting languages and the adversarial mindset. He has also participated in various interesting-sounding hacking competitions, whose names I will not read here, except for the Holiday Hack Challenge / KringleCon. You'll have to tell us what that is. John Hammond, over to you.
All righty. How's audio? You can hear me all right? All right. Excellent. Hey, thanks so much. Grateful, super thankful to be here with you all, and appreciate the warm welcome, Adam. Yeah, my name's John Hammond. Huntress is my day job, YouTube kind of on the side, but I am certainly one of the nerds and geeks trying to spend time on the keyboard and stay in the trenches, try to be in the front lines. If I may, if we are trying to take some opening remarks or some sentiment to share, I would still remind us, because I think it's very, very easy to get into the idea of, we would love to chat about the hot stuff, the sexy, the complex and sophisticated threats and attack chains. But I would remind us, hey, the small stuff still works. It's boring to talk about, the baby basics, the boilerplate stuff of long, complex passwords, and don't click links in emails, and two-factor authentication, blah, blah, blah. You've all heard it before. But the reason that we all keep screaming and shouting about that is because that's part of the answer. That's part of the right answer. Because that stuff is really what could be an open door or a weakness in an attack vector into an environment. there was one case and incident, and I won't ramble for too long, forgive me, but there was one I think that is pertinent to a lot of the conversations we might have here, because we were trying to help with an organization that is more of the important national security, part of influence spot, one of the national security think tanks doing research and trying to understand weapons and arms, nuclear weapons for some of our foreign adversaries, if that's fair to say. And they had brought in to some of their machines, their hosts, they were trialing Huntress, again, my day job, and we'd uncovered a lot of those persistent footholds, the implants or the beacons as to how a hacker adversary might still maintain their access. And that's been sitting there dormant, lurking and dwelling in the environment for a year. And they would be trying to do some stealthy stuff. As we were chatting about some of the espionage efforts, think of a keylogger, think of something that will, capture everything you type, and even kind of steal the information that's in your open web browsers between maybe you're on the internet and whatever website you're on, the title, the page contents, especially inside of an internal network where there's sensitive data back and forth, that could be pretty juicy, worthwhile information for an adversary. And that, truthfully, we pull back the curtain, we try to understand the whole threat, root cause analysis, and we find that this is just from a phishing email, which I know a lot of us might roll our eyes and groan at, like, oh goodness, we've heard that 1,000 times. But look, it just takes one. And that is kind of the opportunity that threat actors will look for, the low-hanging fruit, and they can get that complicated, elite, sexy, kernel driver, zero-day exploit stuff, but if the easy stuff works, then that's all they need. With that, I'll keep us cruising.
Great, thank you. And finally, Lieutenant Colonel Jason Brown, who is an information conflict research scientist and assistant professor at the Army Cyber Institute at West Point. His research interests include studying the safe and good, that's not my air quotes, those are in the bio, good integration, and you'll tell us why those air quotes are there, integration of artificial intelligence into society and future applications of AI in military operations. He's an expert in threat casting and imagining ways to avoid, mitigate, and recover from threats in the future. Lieutenant Colonel Brown.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so yesterday I had an opportunity to share a little bit more about what threat casting is. And I won't go over much of it today, but I will point out the strategic threats that Dean Chesney talked about. I'm actually going to drill down to a couple really, really small ones that are probably emerging. And they're not the phishing ones, but they're probably going to pivot off of those. This is from some of our previous threat casting work. And it has to do a little bit with artificial intelligence. It has to do with applications of AI to creating a threat space. And two that came from our 2021 report on digital weapons of mass disruption. And we took a play on words on that because we felt that these technologies were, their sole purpose was to disrupt normal processes, our bureaucracies, even our cognitions as humans. And the first one is about the future of reputation management. Why is reputation management a threat? Well, you have high-value individuals, and we all can name them. There's a few of them sitting on this stage here, that if they were disrupted, certain organizations would have a bad day for a little while. But if you go higher up into government and you take them out of the fight for a day or two, they have much more impactful effects than taking out somebody like me, who's just I'm a lieutenant colonel, one of tens of thousands of them in the Army. Actually was week before last, the director of the FBI came to West Point to give a lecture to the cadets, and the ACI, the Army Cyber Institute, had a few minutes to talk with them. And I said, we have some projects that his Q division, the ones that make all the cool technology devices for the FBI, they work with some of my cadets on small semester-long projects about systems analysis. And I said, one of them that they're working on right now is the question from the FBI is, how do you know when an executive is being manipulated externally? And that's a really, really tough question. And I turned to him and I said, we've narrowed it down and said, what happens if you have implanted medical devices? How do you know that those medical devices are manipulating your decision making. And I said, I don't have that. And turned to the Honorable Mr. Ray, and I said, imagine you had an implanted pacemaker. I don't have to cause you to have a heart attack. I don't have to hack it to make you drop dead. All I have to do is give it just enough abnormalities that it puts you in the hospital for tests all day long, and you're behind those thick concrete hospital walls where you can't get any cell signal, and I've just taken you out of the fight for an entire day while they try to figure out that your device is actually working just fine and your heart is just fine. And his eyes kind of got big. So that kind of goes to what the value of these high value individuals that the adversaries know they need to pinpoint. And let me go back to reputation management. So there are some celebrities and there's VIPs that can manage their public profile, their reputation online, the way that people perceive them. But for the masses, that doesn't happen. A couple of summers ago, we had some cadets at the ACI looking at Army officers' public profile pages on Twitter and Facebook. And there's over 400 general officers. And they scanned through some of them. They stopped counting after about 50 or so fake profiles for one particular general officer. And that was just the publicly facing things. And they said, we just stopped counting. For example, the Army Chief of Chaplains had like 40 different pages. Many of them were just Bible verses of the day. They were replications of each other, which means that they were sock puppets feeding that information. But what we looked at was General Nakasone, who was the former Cybercom commander and director of NSA, had 0 public profiles on Twitter and Facebook, which means he has a team to be able to help manage that reputation. But that's one of there's only about a dozen 4-star generals, and very few of them have these publicly facing profiles that can be manipulated. But what does that mean for anybody who's not a 4-star general? What does that mean for somebody who is, the dean of the law school? How many public, profiles do you have? See, this is an emerging threat that I think is going to cause us some problems in the future. The second emerging threat that we found is something we called stochastic terrorism. Wait a minute, what does that mean? Well, in mathematics, stochastic modeling is you have a random probability distribution, and you can analyze it statistically, but you can't necessarily predict it. And this is sort of these messaging bubbles where messaging and media are designed to radicalize or inspire acts of violence without explicitly calling for it, because they're just getting this positive feedback loop. And in systems design, positive feedback loops reinforce certain behaviors, and eventually positive feedback loops will actually crash the system. But the interesting thing about stochastic terrorism is that they're not predetermined targets. We look at people who buy guns or go to certain forums, for example, and law enforcement can track those. But people who are doing these, who are probabilistically capable of doing terrorism, and because they join these forums, they're not necessarily ones that are visible. So the interesting thing about that is that we can't detect these terrorist acts preemptively, but only after the fact. And the question is, can AI help with that? And I'm not certain yet that AI has the capability, because they are so probabilistic in themselves. They take data and they perform analysis on the data in a way that is still mathematical. It's not yet intuitive. And I think that those are two problems that are going to emerge that we have to do something about. Over to you.
Great. Thank you to all of you. One question jumps out to my mind, and it's for John Hammond. Why is it still possible to unleash a horrible cyber catastrophe for your entire organization just by clicking a bad link? Why is the entire system designed around the one thing that experience has shown does not exist, which is vigilance and sophistication on the part of the end user?
Ooh, kind of right in the lion's den, quite a can of worms. Look, I'll try to approach that the best that I can. Cognizant that, look, even now, I can parallel it well, I think, to today's day and age, where we are excited about new innovation and new technology and new stuff and what we can do and how we can do research and development and build incredible things. AI may be a cornerstone of that in our current conversations. But look, we think about the earlier days when we're trying to figure out how we build the internet, or we write computers, we make software. Security wasn't really the forefront of our minds. And hey, we just thought we can build cool stuff. We can make technology and have all this come to life. But the safety, the structure, the stability, and how sturdy something might be with the potential for vulnerabilities or exploits and weaknesses just really wasn't something that we thought about. And now I think we're trying to chase that. We're trying to catch up, which sucks. I'll be the first to admit. And I realize we're on a little bit of a treadmill. But look, you hear a whole lot of government spots and agencies now talking about, we got to figure out a software bill of materials. Ooh, can we get the ingredients used in the recipe to make this program and this application? We talk about the supply chain. What are the risks of, hey, some other third-party vendor having a vulnerability that might trickle down to us in a domino effect? I think even, I might be forgetting if it's the White House or who specifically said, like, look, we got to get into these memory-safe programming languages and code so stuff is tight and locked up and all the doors and windows are locked and secured as they should be. We didn't do that at the start. So I don't know if that answers your question well, Adam, I hope, but that's where we are now and how, yeah, it is still possible to, have all these things sort of fall through the cracks when there is a crack.
Great, thank you. Let's structure the next few questions as a bit of a lightning round. And I'm going to put the pressure on each of you to actually answer the question with one thing concisely and no hedging. Okay. And I've prepped them on this, so they have no excuse for not being ready. Can you share with us one piece of cyber news, one little thing that caught your attention? Not the biggest, most obvious thing, but something that you noticed as an expert that you think more people should be aware of because it's telling as an indicator of where you think things are going, maybe in the past year or so. Whoever wants to go first, whoever feels most ready, jump at it, and then we'll run down the line.
I'll jump in.
Dean Chesney.
So I think one thing that I would really love people to pay more attention to is the growing capability to replicate people's voices. Now, we've been talking about phishing, tricking people into clicking on stuff, and the inherent vulnerability of the human tendency to just trust things are as they appear to be. We are very accustomed to the idea that, well, as long as you heard the voice that you recognize telling you to make that wire transfer, you can go ahead and do that. That is no longer a safe assumption. When Danielle Citron and I co-authored a paper on deepfakes in 2018, trying to draw attention to this emergent capability, one of the things we forecasted was deep phishing, using deeply realistic, beyond the ability of your ears and eyes to detect that it's fake, replications of real people to spearfish in a much more sophisticated, high-end way. There are a number of known examples at this point of this sort of capability being used with some effect. So buckle up. It could get to the point where if you're not in the room with somebody you know, you just can't be sure it's who you think it is.
Great, thank you.
I have one, and it isn't a year old. A couple of years ago, China passed a sort of a pseudo-national privacy law that says like you just can't export data. Okay, great. What does that mean for us? In the United States, you can buy publicly available information all sorts of places in all sorts of ways. But what does that mean for our intelligence communities? How do we get information on Chinese populations? We have to have deep intelligence that go in there and do that. And it's much more difficult than we think. And that small change of forbidding exportation of their citizens' data makes it much more difficult for us to train models and reciprocate in a defensive way.
And just for everyone's awareness, the White House recently put out an executive order on preventing the sale of Americans' personal data to foreign powers, which is a good step, but it is harder than it sounds if other people can still buy that same personal data on the domestic market. And so to some extent, the data brokerage business market is the actual problem, business model is the actual problem here. Okay, John Hammond and Francesca Lockhar.
Okay, something I think worth harping on. I try to chase a lot, and I'll move quick because I know it's a lightning round. I try to chase a lot of emerging vulnerabilities, stuff that, hey, the internet starts to get worried about. I don't know if folks, again, nerds or geeks in the room, were tracking like a Log4j or a MoveIt or a proxy shell, blah, blah, blah. One of the most recent ones was a thing called Screen Connect that was used by a lot of those managed security providers, small mid-market businesses, and that had sort of that one-to-many approach where it could have a lot of connected computers to it. So if you exploit that mothership, all of the downstream computers could also just be hacked. And that's kind of a wild thing, and it's very attractive for a threat actor or an adversary, especially when you think of the potential for ransomware and that money-making machine. But oddball thing, even when we saw MoveIt or some of those adversaries we were alluding to earlier, Clop is one just as well. Lace Tempest is their cool hipster threat actor name. But they would deploy and take advantage of this vulnerability, and they would not deploy ransomware to exploit and encrypt and lock down all of the workstations, but they would still, hey, use the stolen data and exfiltrated confidential information as leverage, as extortion, as ransom. And it's interesting, I think, that there is a little bit of a trend now to think we don't need to encrypt all of your data, just simply having it is enough to use as leverage and enough to threaten that company or business or organization environment. I think we'll see more of that, but I think it's worth bubbling that up to the surface as a talk track.
Quickly, I just want to tack on to what Dean Chesney said as a preface to my answer to this question, but I'll be quick. With regard to deepfakes and just the kind of evolving speed of some of these technologies, one thing I always stress to the students is that the field and what makes a good cybersecurity defensive posture, one, there's not really one right answer, and two, that answer changes almost every day. So when we think about like traditional training to build resilience and fix human vulnerabilities around phishing, we train stuff like, okay, if you think you're receiving a suspicious email that's directing you to invoice or wire some payment, pick up the phone and call the person and make sure they actually sent the email. Well, what if the voice on the other end isn't really them? Well, that training goes out the window. And we see a lot of that training also changing with regard to AI and the use of generative AI like ChatGPT to craft even better phishing emails that don't even look suspicious to begin with. So there's been a lot kind of made of the role of ChatGPT in making phishing emails more sophisticated, and I think the most concrete kind of evidence around that was released by IBM's threat research team last fall. They essentially found there was like a 3% decrease in the efficacy of phishing emails in terms of people clicking on them within the company, from emails that they previously spent about 16 hours crafting, researching the employee, researching their personal lives, trying to make it as convincing as possible, versus ChatGPT generated phishing emails that only took about 5 minutes to write. So we see a 3% difference, which is basically within the margin of error, between a phishing email that's highly targeted, highly crafted toward an individual, takes about 16 hours to write, and then one that takes 5 minutes to write. So it really bears foot stomping and mentioning that the threat is increasing exponentially, and a lot of our kind of conventional training and wisdom around combating these threats is frankly no longer kind of effective in the wake of some of these technologies. So one item that's been on my mind that I think kind of went somewhat unnoticed just in the flurry of executive orders and actions recently by the administration to combat the cyber threat from China was the executive order around maritime and port security. And a lot was made of, you know, there are these essentially Chinese-made cranes that are present in U.S. ports, which, as we all might be aware, are responsible from somewhere between 75 to 90% of goods coming into the country, et cetera, et cetera. The cranes were a big focus, but also within that executive order, the Coast Guard was given the ability to not just inspect maritime vessels, cranes, and facilities, but also do incident response and serve as kind of a frontline first responder defense force for maritime partners and for port security cybersecurity partners. And that's really important to me when we go back to the concept of building trust within cybersecurity response and knowing who to call if you suffer an incident, particularly one that could be as impactful as interrupting a port, interrupting critical infrastructure. The fact that we're kind of dispersing these responsibilities, we have CISA here, we have FBI here, we have the Coast Guard here, and we're shoring up the ability to integrate with and work with essentially friends and build public-private partnerships, leveraging those that already exist is really critical. So I see that as a bright spot in terms of how we're thinking about incident response and disseminating the responsibility for cybersecurity amongst our critical infrastructure sectors, not just relying on operators, and then by extension, not just relying on CISA to help them when they might not be the most trusted or present boots on the ground partner in every case.
You mentioned trust. How does trust factor into this? Is there enough public trust in the relevant agencies for the public to notify the government, work together with the government, invite the government in to remediate things? And you could think of this on various axes. Companies that don't want to tell the government their business, citizens who fear or suspect the government, people who don't trust one agency that's distant from them but might trust someone who's more familiar to them, as you were just talking about, Professor Lockhar. I'm going to throw this one up there as a jump ball. Is there enough trust, and if not, how do we reclaim trust?
Let me share a recent experience, real world. The city of Augusta had some ransomware event happen last year, and it shut down part of their city. Right next to the city of Augusta, Georgia, is Fort Eisenhower, which is where our Army Cyber Headquarters is, and our Cyber Center of Excellence. And our general officers and our leaders over there reached out to the city and said, how can we help? And they said, no thanks, we don't need your help, we have it taken care of. So part of our portfolio at the Army Cyber Institute is a cute name called Jack Voltaic. It's a series of cybersecurity and critical infrastructure tabletop exercises we've been doing, but now we're trying to federate it out and create education and outreach rather than do the exercises ourselves. So one of our project managers reached out to the city and said, I'd like to talk to you about some of the after actions that happen. Can we just at least record some of that data? He finally was able to get a hold of the city's CISO and have an interview with her. But he found other people that he was just going down the Rolodex and asking, can I come and talk to you? And many of these workers said, no thanks, I don't want to talk to anybody about this one. So I think some of the issue is in a cyber incident like this, many of the public servants are not trained to understand how the government can actually help. What we can do, if we bring back these lessons, it's because it becomes very central about them and about getting, whether or not they're going to get in trouble on a personal level rather than spending those minutes sharing a lesson that another city might benefit from.
I have a few thoughts I want to share on this relating to CISA. We've talked about CISA a little bit. I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what it is. So the Department of Homeland Security had previously an entity called the National Protection and Programs Directorate. The acronym is NPPD. The whole point is that it was an anodyne acronym that didn't really tell you what it did. It was, over time, the home base for, one, being the place in the federal government where somebody who was knowledgeable was pushing the rest of the civilian parts of federal government to better protect their own systems. That's a complex story, but it evolved into being the main place for that. And then increasingly being the, if you will, sort of a fire department, non-law enforcement, non-regulatory, we're just here to help you when there's problems, government entity at the federal level to at least help critical infrastructure sectors, where in the United States, most of that's held by the private sector. So eventually it was rebranded as the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and it's been that since, basically about 7 or 8 years now. It was really interesting. If you think about that period, 7 or 8 years, that's about the time period we've been in this vortex of distrust where every day the headlines seem worse and crazier. We seem ever more divided. We all know the story. We're going through this paroxysm of distrust and tribalism in our country and elsewhere in the world that's making everything harder. It's not the first time in American history we've been through a cycle of systematically declining trust, but it's the one we're dealing with currently. CISA, during the Trump administration years, CISA, right up until the end, was sort of conspicuous for flying under the radar of a lot of that and simply operating on its core mission in a way that did never seem to generate political headlines, didn't generate political controversy. Eventually, towards the end, that reversed real quick in relation to the election, because part of the critical infrastructure that CISA is there to try to assist with would be election infrastructure. That itself is a complex topic, but in connection with the topic of disinformation about the security of election infrastructure, there were a lot of narratives out there suggesting that this was insecure, that's insecure. The head of CISA, Chris Krebs, had a really visible public role trying to calm everyone down and focus on the truth, which was that, in fact, the systems were, in fact, secure. That became a political controversy. Probably some of you remember that Chris ends up being fired very late in the Trump administration. Since that time, okay, so now next administration comes along. CISA, and during the Biden years, has been led by Jen Easterly. Chris and Jen are both fabulous, talented, wonderful public servants that are just interested in doing what's good for the country and doing their jobs. But as Chris's experience illustrated, you can still get political headwinds that relate to our distrust challenges. And for CISA, part of the problems, actually, some of it involved the advisory committee that I served on. I wasn't part of this part of the work, but one of the things the advisory committee was doing was just trying to come up with ideas to help CISA in its thinking. And there was a stream of work around disinformation more broadly. And this, of course, became politically sensitive. And I assume, I haven't been sitting in all the conference activities, but I'm sure it's in the minds of anyone who's involved in this event that the very idea of trying to grapple with the problem of false information and false narratives that are propagating is itself a political battlefield these days, which makes it really, really hard to deal with. I think the lesson for CISA had turned out to be, try to stay away from that piece of the work, try to focus more on the nuts and bolts of cybersecurity and physical infrastructure security. That was probably a wise move for them to get more focused on that. But it just highlights the layer of politics that complicates so much of the work that we're talking about doing. It's always there in the background, and in an age where every institution suffers from declining trust, well, it makes the task all that much harder.
That's incredibly well said, and I'll just say in my experience, and having been in Washington for many years, it is incumbent on people who want to do a political professional work to walk an incredibly narrow tightrope. And one way to do that, which I think too many public servants neglect, is to at least sample the other side's information bubble. The idea that one side's living in a world of truth and the other side is mired in disinformation is a very comforting narrative to wrap ourselves in. We all wrap ourselves in it because we all trust the bubble that we've placed ourselves in. But it's really incumbent, ideally, on all citizens, but most of all on public leaders who are stewards of institutions and have to protect that institution's credibility with the broad population for it to work, to get out there and sample the other side's information bubble to see how what you are doing is going to resonate. And we see that when people do that well, they're able to have some success. And when people don't do that, it's like running through a minefield with a blindfold on. Okay, and on a similarly uplifting subject, and then we're going to get to some optimism. But first, let's complete the layer of gloom. One trend that makes you most worried for cybersecurity in the United States or the world. What are you most worried about? And then we're going to do the opposite to make you happy.
I'll pop in first, if you don't mind. I another kind of conventional wisdom about cybersecurity and combating some of the threats kind of on the hyper local individualized level is that Gen Z is growing up as digital natives, right? They have digital literacy from a very young age. That surely makes them, more resilient to those kinds of attacks, to those kinds of threats, to those kinds of scams. And maybe the problem will somewhat right itself as Gen Z enters the workforce and is less susceptible to some of these vulnerabilities and exploits. And it seems like that's actually not the case. In fact, recent data showing that Gen Z is actually being scammed at higher rates than some of their counterparts because there's not this media literacy and ability to kind of scope and scan and use critical thinking to determine whether what you're looking at is true or false. And of course that tracks with the increasing convincingness of deep fakes and other things. But it makes me really concerned for our students, and as part of shameless self-promotion, tells me how important it is that we build just basic digital and media literacy into our cybersecurity related curriculum for this generation, because they're just as prone to mistake, if not more so, than their elders, if you will. That trend really concerns me.
Boomers for the win. You didn't see that one coming at the cyber conference.
I'll throw one out just real quick. The attempt, so after Colonial Pipeline happened, you saw this push to try to do some regulatory things to drive pipeline cybersecurity. And that got everyone thinking like, hey, well, what else is like that? Okay, how about the rail system? And that ran into a political buzzsaw and the pushback on the effort to try to drive some pretty basic, not that big a deal cybersecurity mandates into the rail industry. It was sort of a generic sort of like, hey, keep the government out of our business sort of nature. But it was a very disturbing sign that it really is hard to introduce any pro-cybersecurity novel regulatory measures without first experiencing Colonial Pipeline, Pearl Harbor type fiascos. And the effect tends to be limited. The little political window that opens up then is limited to that little industrial sector, and you can't get the benefit of extending it to other sectors.
I think the one thing that keeps me up at night is a concept of micro-targeting and using computers, AI to generate messaging for the individual. But that's kind of happening right now. The part that keeps me up is the micro-targeting that can happen at the genetic level, and the ability for computers to take the human genome and home CRISPR kits and advances in genetic technologies to be able to theoretically change how we see ourselves as being human. And that it's a convergence of data that's available, the speed of computing, the reduced cost of the computing, and people who can do these things now at home and at scale.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll be quick. I don't want to be a broken record or beat a dead horse here, but the deep fake and the voice phishing stuff is what scares me. Being someone who is eternally online and a content creator or influencer, air quote, persona, I have thousands of videos of me on camera. And you look at a generation, or you look at yourselves, whether, I don't know, the younger folks are on a TikTok or a YouTube or a Facebook equivalent, if it's all video and audio, and if the adversary and if the enemy can clone and impersonate that for maybe, again, we'll point this to you, your person of choice for trust, for news, for an individual or authority online that you like. Maybe you listen to a podcast. If that is replicated and then used for malicious intent, it will work every single time without fail. And that one spooks me. That one, I'll admit, keeps me up a little bit. Yeah.
I'll throw one out there. It seems like a lot of these discussions in the information sphere and cyber are about the basic challenge of being basically apes who are dealing with things that are happening at computer speed, machine sophistication, and we are relying on our ape instincts to try to deal with these threats that are coming at us in incredibly modern and sophisticated ways. And it's, what do we trust? Whom do we trust? Whose face do we recognize? Whose voice do we recognize? Does that look suspicious? Okay, if not, I'll click it. And we analyze these questions from the perspective of these Platonic theorists, philosopher kings sitting here up on the stage and in government, worrying about the other apes and how dumb they are, and they need our help to overcome their base instincts and click on these things and trust people. The problem is that the people doing the protecting are also apes. And they have the same instincts, and they have the same inclination to trust people they like and things that they agree with, and all of the same cognitive biases and shortcomings that we all have. And ultimately, if we do get into a conflict, we are going to be relying on those people to make wise decisions, to not be fooled, to not over-rely on information within their own sphere. And so this is a real problem. We forget that, for example, people in government are also on social media and are also absorbing highly filtered information that is working on them in emotionally incendiary ways. I don't know that there's an easy way out of this. I don't know if there's an easy way out of any of these things, but that's what worries me. Okay, we're all very worried. You all are probably ready to head to the bar right now. Let's give some good news, and please get some questions ready in the audience. Good news. What is the thing you are most optimistic about or hopeful about, a trend that can give these people a reason to go home and log onto their computers without trembling with fear?
Can I get the party started? Hey, I think, and this is really good, positive, glass half full, optimistic. We are getting better. We are getting better at detecting vulnerabilities. We are getting better at jumping in on, incident response, stuff that we need to get up in action for. We're getting better at being a little bit more proactive and preventive. And I see this especially with a lot of, again, emerging vulnerabilities or threats that endanger the internet in the moment. And the fast, rapid response to be able to jump on top of that and then get everyone in on the fight, sharing and collaborating is really cool to see, and now more than ever. And this is especially topical, I think very, very current. We've gotten really so good at it that it's in a day's notice, and we're coordinating with the vendor. Hey, if there is a weakness or flaw in some software that could be cause for alarm. It's funny, this is a very current example of with Rapid7 and JetBrains, and I don't want to get too nerdy, but if folks see that in the news, they're genuine conversations of like, we're moving so quick now that we have sort of the ethical conversations of, hey, you patched this and fixed this, but we were supposed to do the write-up and the explanation for detection guidance and mitigations and remediations, and then they sort of like point a finger back at each other like, hey, you let the cat out of the bag first, which is weird that we have to have that conversation, but it's also something that I'd put a light on and say, holy cow, it's good that we're having these conversations because that means that we're almost real time, really, really good at getting better at being on top of this or being out ahead of this and in front of it. So that is something that I'm optimistic, and we are getting better and running faster on the treadmill, maybe.
Okay, next, at risk of sounding like somewhat of a broken record, I think the information sharing environment and the public-private partnerships in cybersecurity are getting much stronger and both growing in number and in kind of the strength of their efficacy. And I'll give kind of a few great examples that I want to specifically call out. So one is the Texas Department of Public Safety, which it was mentioned that I previously worked at. For those of you not from here, Texas is nation-sized, and so to that end has essentially a intelligence division that rivals the size of some countries' intelligence divisions, I would say. And that division coordinates extremely closely with federal partners as well as with local partners on kind of every manner of threat, of which Texas essentially is a cut paste of the threats facing the nation. We have every critical infrastructure sector, there's terrorism, there's gang, et cetera, right? So to that end, the department had a maritime intelligence program, which was a public-private partnership with the Houston Ship Channel Security District to bring it back to maritime security. And this was essentially recognition by 40 of kind of the top Fortune 500 companies that operate in the Port of Houston, which is the largest port in the United States by waterborne tonnage. recognition that if that port were shut down, and indeed it has been before by protesters and other efforts with millions of dollars lost, but if that port were shut down or suffered a serious physical or particularly a cybersecurity incident, they would need intelligence, they would need a law enforcement function, they would need all of the support that, again, we've kind of discussed has been severely lacking in the context of critical infrastructure operators in the private sector in the past. So they essentially partnered with the state to fund threat intelligence analysts who engaged in information sharing with federal partners, with those private sector partners, did trainings, did basic cyber hygiene, awareness services and things like that to better educate and prepare those companies. And we've seen that emerge on the national level as well. So CISA has the JCDC, don't ask me what it stands for at this moment, a Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. It hit me. But this is essentially, again, an information sharing, a threat analysis group that consists of leaders from within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and then chief information security officers, chief threat analysts within major technology providers, major critical infrastructure operators, et cetera. And the goal is not to be regulatory, it's not to be punitive, it's to build trust in information sharing and getting vulnerability information, getting cybersecurity incident information into the right hands, be that a local law enforcement responder like now the Texas Department of Public Safety, for example, be that the Coast Guard, be that the local FBI field office, et cetera. And that is also mirrored in the NSA's Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, which is specifically providing targeted information sharing and cybersecurity services for small businesses that have defense contracts and serve the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base. And that, while still in its kind of nascent stages, seems to be an extremely promising way of reaching out to defense contractors, which do have a baseline of security configuration that they are supposed to be meeting, and in my view, previously had almost no help getting up to that baseline, right? Which means they won't win defense contracts, or maybe they will, and then that poses a risk to kind of the broader DIB if they suffer an incident or some kind of intrusion. So I'm really pleased with kind of the scope and scale of public-private partnerships, and I hope that more catch on as that idea hopefully grows and stays insulated somewhat from the political winds around it.
So here's one ray of sunshine. So one of the vectors of cyber challenge involves botnets, where there's a large number of devices that get compromised by a single actor who can then use them to, say, launch a distributed denial of service attack or some other harmful activity. And in the past, when you've had a situation where the U.S. government's aware that there's a botnet involving a lot of compromised computers, and in theory, you could, if you could seize the command and control server that's controlling the botnet, you could just sort of go in and take control of the botnet, order it to delete itself. We've been very reluctant to do that because that involves actually intruding without the consent of the owner into the computers of thousands upon thousands of individuals. And so in the past, we've been very reluctant to be very bold to take that sort of remedial, non-investigative, just remedial step. When core flood, the core flood situation about a decade ago was an example of a very large systematic problem of this kind, in which the solution was work through everybody's internet service provider to try to notify all the individuals, including all of our relatives who wouldn't know what any of this means, to tell them, hey, you've got this problem, you need to take these steps. There was a fair amount of uptake in those remedial steps, but a huge number of machines remained infected. And more recently, the government's shown some boldness in going ahead and getting a warrant from a magistrate judge that would allow them, in effect, kind of creatively, to go ahead and just skip we'll tell you about the problem, ask you to fix it. We're just going to seize control of the command server, and we're going to order the botnet to delete itself. And so in connection with the Volt Typhoon episode I described a moment ago, one of the mechanisms that the Chinese actors were using to try to hide the connection between some of their activities and their own servers to obscure their role was a particular botnet that was exploiting small office and home office routers that people were using that were still functional but were no longer being maintained by Cisco or whoever supplied them with security updates, and so they're easily exploited. And the FBI got a warrant from a magistrate judge that allowed it to simply take out the thing using no consent from the owners, but instead simply treating this as if it was a search, and we were in effect taking the instrumentalities of the crime out of these homes pursuant to the search warrant. It's very controversial. There are those who say, hey, this opens the door to government intrusion in a way that's not really, the warrant system's not designed to enable. I think there's something to those arguments, but in the meantime, I think it's an important sign that the scale of the harm is such that we need to be creative. We need to be willing to do that sort of thing. And in this case, it seems like it was very valuable to have done it.
So this is going to be kind of strange coming from a military person. If the problem sets that we've been talking about this morning are because of machines, I think the solution space is because of humans. It's something that I've learned in 24 years of service in the military, and rightfully being at the other end of an enemy's barrel, literally. Is that there's always a human element in solutions to conflict, and we've been talking about different types of conflict, whether or not you recognize it today or not. And it's the patience, it's the creativity, it's the motivation to win that humans have that machines do not have. That I think would cause us to triumph over any of these problems that the machines have created for us, or that we've created because of the machines.
That's uplifting. On a similarly, hopefully, uplifting note, I'll offer one. It's that the negative, worrying nature of the discussion does not present a full picture of reality. And I especially mean this in the context of our great power rivalries. Here we sit as Americans agonizing over all of our vulnerabilities. Every single little piece of malware that somebody puts into a water system in Vermont is national news about how we're being dominated in the cyber realm by Iran or by China or by Russia. We're having these conversations because that's how we operate as a society. We're very open. We exhaustively catalog our own flaws in our media and so forth, which is great, although it makes us stressed because we then act to fix those things. In other societies where it's taboo or even illegal to talk about these kind of flaws and vulnerabilities, the result is often that they don't get fixed. And so I'll ask you, do you really think that we are so helpless when it comes to China, Russia, Iran, other hostile cyber actors? We have the world's best people sitting in Maryland and elsewhere working for NSA. CIA has developed a very sophisticated cyber capability you can see based on open sources. DoD has its own capabilities through Cyber Command and in the services. We are very well equipped. And the fact that our adversaries are reluctant to talk about their failings makes them even more vulnerable because they don't fix things. Many of these societies also have deep corruption, which, too bad for them, but it's a vulnerability that our intelligence agencies can exploit to gain access. And I hope they're doing so, and I'm confident that they're doing so. So if it does come to conflict, I think we can rest assured that we are not hands down in allowing ourselves to be one-dimensionally taken advantage of. We are ready as well. And in the meantime, we are strengthening things on our end and fixing ourselves to be prepared. Audience, it is your turn. Hands up. I think we have some mics circulating. I can't see any of you. You sat too far in the back. That's your own fault, but we'll find you. And please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Hi, Kevin Lentz. Sorry, I'm sitting back in the darkness up here. So I have like a 30,000-foot question here, and this gets back to the...
I think that's about how far away you are from us right now.
Okay, let me get back on track. This goes back to the toolkit that Dean Chesney was talking about. So Jason mentioned General Nakasone. In his testimony in Congress, you can hear over and over again, he talks about our greatest asset that gives us scale and capabilities and advantage in our strategic competition is the private sector. Now, that's great, but the private sector is legally constrained. They don't have authorities to do a lot of stuff. You know, they're authorized to tell CISA how badly they got robbed, and that's great. In the past, governments have issued letters of marque, say, to when things were scrappy, for people with the capabilities to give them the authorities to sort of go after and pursue the competition. That's risky. That's escalatory. We've kind of decided that we're not going to do that in the U.S. Instead, the government will handle it. You know, Adam, you painted a rosy picture there, and maybe the government is handling it, and I just don't know, but it kind of seems like the government's not got a great handle on it, per se. So my question is, what are some alternate legal political frameworks or policy frameworks for harnessing or mobilizing the private sector in this fight, the tech companies and stuff? Because it seems like we're doing it ad hoc. Ukraine's a great example. Microsoft's, up to their hips in a war in Ukraine, and it seems like we're muddling through, and I'm worried that will only get us so far. So are there alternate frameworks for thinking about how to get the private sector in this? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Kevin. So you raised one of my favorite topics when I was still in the classroom. My favorite part of the cyber course was when we got to Hackback and started talking about this question of, if somebody steals your bike and you're watching them leaving your driveway, get the bike, maybe you go stop them yourself. In the physical world, we have a lot of well thought through ideas about what is the role of the private individual in defending their own stuff. And a lot of that ends with that can spiral out of control. That's why you call 911. That's why the state gives the monopoly on the use of force to the state's agents so they can go deal with it and control escalation. But in the cyber domain, it doesn't work so well because you can't really call 911, get an immediate response. And so for many years, there's been discourse about, should we make it more clear that it would be lawful in some fashion for at least a well-resourced company to go after its own stuff, to hack back when they've been hacked. There's been a bill introduced a couple times in Congress called the ACDC Act, Active Cyber, I forget what it stands for, but it was ACDC, so it was memorable. And it never got anywhere because it sounds right at the 30,000 foot layer that the physical world analogies don't really map very well onto the cyber world analogies when it comes to companies that are being hacked and important, valuable IP or whatever is being taken out. But when you start trying to figure out how to police it and all the potential escalation, the potential confusion, the things that can go wrong, the legislation always ran up against a million obstacles. So whether we think of it through the lens of something like legally authorized hacking back or the distinct idea of a letter of marque and reprisal that would in effect deputize a private actor to act with state sovereign authority outside state boundaries in ways that otherwise would make them vulnerable to criminal prosecution. I don't think we've solved how we can do that in a way that doesn't cause as many problems or more problems than we start with. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to do all we can to make sure that if and when push comes to shove in a more serious way, as it did ultimately become so for Ukraine, that we have the ability to get benefit in important ways from Microsoft and others. I think those relationships, this goes back to what Chesney was saying earlier, JCDC, and a million other ways in which there are formal and informal connectivity between relevant government agencies and key, most capable private sector actors. I think a lot of that stuff is sort of there and incipient. I don't think we've built a full-on legal framework for pulling those capabilities into direct action. But whether it's through National Guard or through things that NSA's tried to do with people who come in briefly for rotations just for a little while, then go back out into private sector, these are all ways of groping towards that same insight that rests on this foundation. Most of the most talented people, many of the most talented people, are staying in the private sector, and they're not as willing as they would have been maybe 20 years ago to go to Fort Meade and work there. So there are active efforts to try to address that, but that's all I've got to say about it.
I do have a couple of points to add to that. Experiments with things like regulatory sandboxes and pushes for self-governance type of activities as soft law. I think we have not exhausted all the possibilities in terms of defense of personal data and defense of corporate data, those kind of things. And I think there could be some emphasis on exploring how to allow a company to expand their perimeter a little bit more than just their fence line. And what does that mean? Where's that regulatory sandbox that allows them to step outside of their boundaries just a little bit in order to provide a little bit deeper defense in depth?
Hi, Dan Cox, U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies. First, this panel is excellent, just like every other panel here. This is one of the best conferences I've ever attended, so thank you. My question is very similar, unfortunately. So there's a law in the Reagan administration that actually prevents businesses from attacking back. The law states that they can only attack within their system. Several prominent tech companies have committed offensive cyber operations. Microsoft argued, I think it was REvil that attacked them, that once they attacked, they become part of their system. And so they attacked back and actually destroyed computers on the other side. Army Cyber has a battalion of offensive cyber operators, but it only ends up being about less than 30 teams. We're not doing much in offensive cyber operations. So I wondered how the panel would feel sort of more broadly about lowering authorities. They're almost all held at the strategic level for the military and government, and actually really broadening what a business can do in offensive cyber. And I'm actually flabbergasted. There's this cultural predisposition, it's especially prominent in political circles, about being fearful of escalation. Our enemies are escalating, right? And we're fearful of them while they attack us constantly, right? So that I don't understand at all. Thank you.
A few quick thoughts on that. Yeah. So the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, it's very clear that if you go outside your own system, you're taking legal risk on for sure. If you know you're going to be operating in a way that's, to use your example, Dan, there are circumstances where companies will take that risk. And there are a lot of examples that no one can quite pin down, but it's widely believed that you can outsource some amount of help from capable private sector security firms located in other countries. It's often claimed that there are Israeli companies that American large Fortune 500 companies will go to for some very secret, quiet help. It's a legally high risk thing, unless and until legislation paves the way to make it clear you can't be prosecuted for that. It's not something that most general counsels are going to tell their CEO they should do. To your point about the capabilities that aren't being used, so why not have an arrangement instead of asking the companies or making it possible for the companies to legally strike back on their own? Why not treat more of these foreign sourced intrusions into American networks as the equivalent of planes that have entered American airspace, right? And treating it as a governmental response capability. It becomes a political policy strategic judgment about when something in the cyber domain that's happening in American systems has risen to the level where Cyber Command will be asked to take on a role in intervening. And I don't have anything smart to say about how we might change what the calculus is. I think earlier I was trying to get this idea that we are gradually getting a bit more bold, but we're way far away from what some call the release the hounds moment, where when someone's screwing with American companies from abroad, we quickly get involved with some of our biggest and baddest capabilities. I don't think there's a lot of appetite there, and I think it's rooted a lot in what you said, Dan, that there's just this nebulous fear, sometimes for good reason, sometimes more nebulous, about escalation. And we experience escalation dominance all the time in cyberspace, not in the good way. We are the ones who experience the fear that others are willing to go further than we'd be willing to go. This goes back at least to the Obama administration when Iran was going after American banks. And the public record shows that there was a very express escalation dominance discussion in the Oval Office, concluding that they were willing to go further than we were willing to go. And it was time to bring that back and forth to an end, not in a way that was terribly advantageous for us.
I will dare to jump in here, despite being the least qualified to do so on the panel. It strikes me that part of the problem is that the government's incentives are very different than a private sector company. A company may be outraged about the violation it has suffered and want the NSA to use their Cyber Command to use their absolute best and highest tools to respond to this. But of course, those best and highest tools are being saved for higher purposes, at least in the government's eyes. Some of them provide incredible intelligence gathering. Some of them are being kept in reserve as a strategic level deterrent in the case of a conflict. And so we are not going to burn those incredibly hard-won accesses to gain revenge for some kind of data theft from a private sector company. So there's that fundamental misalignment. In terms of the escalation ladder, part of our problem is that we don't have low-end, low-cost things that we can burn cheaply and throw at the problem. We don't do large-scale phishing by government-aligned banks of people sitting at computers hacking out phishing emails. We don't do botnets. Part of the reason is that we portray ourselves legitimately as the protector of the global commons, in this case, the internet commons, and so we don't want to be clogging up the internet commons with junk that destroys trust. But the downside is that we don't have these cheap things that we can throw back at people the way China and Iran and Russia and others do at us. You could argue that the US should have a ransomware capacity and a phishing capacity and a botnet capacity and say, hey, if we do this, you do this to us, we're just going to hit you with this stuff all day. And because these things are cheap and easy to do and don't require sophisticated people or sophisticated accesses, we're willing to burn thousands of them. We'll put 10,000 people in a warehouse in Nevada somewhere sending phishing emails all day long. Is that going to happen? Probably not. So we are sort of disarmed at the low end of the engagement scale compared to some of our adversaries, which is why we always talk about defense. I think we're out of time, so please join me in thanking our great panelists here today. Hopefully they've uplifted and informed you.